I'd like to start off first by thanking Professor Illman for her presentation, and even more than that, introducing us all to the works of Daniel Kempen, Bettina Struble, and the IRCF. For me, in a context increasingly marked by tribal conflicts of every kind, whether they're geopolitical, racial, economic, religious, I can think of few more timely, not to mention urgent endeavors than the Tehillim Salman Project. Especially in light of this morning's events in Thousand Oaks, where we seem to be every day waking up to a new story of violence in our own midst. That question of what does our music making do in a violent world is a pressing and urgent one. Now, because we're talking about the ways in which art offers up models for interreligious dialogue, and perhaps even just dialogue in general, I thought I'd frame my response according to a method drawn from the arts. I am a proud graduate of my local community center's summer class on improvisational theater. And during this brief but intense 2-hour-long seminar, I learned the method of yes and, which, as many of you know, is the key to all great improv, right? So that's how I'd like to respond to Professor Illman's lecture. I want to name and affirm just a few of the insights that I find particularly helpful, insights to which I want to respond with a resounding yes. And I want to offer a few thoughts on the ways in which these insights, I think, push us all to develop and elaborate upon this initial offering, a very musical kind of approach, I think. So, yes, number one, yes to music as inherently meaningful. Professor Illman is right to point out that music is so much more than mere illustration. Whether in the context of interreligious dialogue or not, musical meaning cannot be reduced to its illustrative content or the propositional information that it conveys. In fact, it's the irreducibly oral dimensions of music that lead Rosalind Hackett to call for a sonically aware approach to religious studies. Despite the way we talk about and reflect upon music and musical experiences, music is first and foremost something that we hear. There's an immediacy to it that cannot be reduced to second-order reflection. So yes, music is meaningful in its own right. And if this is indeed the case, then I think it presses us to develop our understanding of music as music, in terms of how its formal structures and oral mechanisms actually contribute something substantive and ineliminable to the interreligious encounter. I think this is an especially important insight as it concerns the notion of sharing but not mixing. There's musical precedent for this, both on formal and phenomenological levels. For instance, as a colleague of ours, Jeremy Begbie, has suggested in numerous different places, the formation of a major triad in the Western tonal system demonstrates one of the ways in which music is structured according to an organic kind of unity and difference. To start with a middle C note, for example, and to add an E and a G is not to do away with the distinctive characteristics of the individual tones, nor is it to synthesize them into some kind of hybrid. Rather, a C major chord simply is the resounding of all three of these notes simultaneously and in their fullness. It's an emergent reality that depends upon and indeed leverages the power of sharing but not mixing. Now, maybe a show of hands. How many of you consider yourselves musicians? Okay. So how many of you are formally trained musicians? Are you catching what that is, the mixing, not sharing of a chord? Okay, since it's only about half of you, and not to leave the other half of you going, what does that mean? Could I go hit notes on the piano? Is that, I didn't ask permission. I'm just gonna do it. Yeah. So, you can hear it pretty easily when you hear it, and it makes total sense, but sometimes if you can't hear it, there's a C. So what's interesting is you don't lose the C by adding an E or adding a G. You get something entirely new or different. Those were great skills, weren't they? And you also see something similar in the video that we just saw of even different instrumentation. It's fascinating when you get these different, really distinct sounds from different instruments that emerged in different cultural settings, how they interweave and blend together. You can't ever not hear the harpsichord, right? I don't out myself, but I'm not a huge harpsichord fan, okay? I've said it there. But it's really fascinating when you introduce that with a cello and with a clarinet, right? I mean, these are fascinating, incredibly distinct tones that we hear that aren't eliminated or reduced when you complement it and add another piece. But in fact, they emerge in some sort of fullness that they weren't able to realize beforehand. So Professor Illman uses the metaphor of a string of pearls to describe this dynamic with the interreligious context. But in the spirit of yes and, I wonder if also a musical metaphor might be one to consider as well. And the reason is because of the ways in which the formal characteristics of music directly inform the musical aesthetic phenomenon. So it's not simply for us to think about music theory as music theory, it's that this sort of notion of a chord or a triad actually directly informs the way we experience the music on a phenomenological level. Although some music scholars would disagree with me, I don't think that music exists on paper. Musical notation is a helpful and in some cases even a necessary abstraction. So for those of you who took piano lessons, it's helpful. But it isn't music. Likewise, musical chords are not abstract constructs. They're oral phenomenon given in our concrete lived experience of the world. And thank you, yeah, amen. And we perceive them in terms of what is known as sympathetic resonance. Simply put, sympathetic resonance is the harmonic phenomenon in which, for example, I strike that middle C note on the piano, and the vibrations of that note cause the upper C string to vibrate even though no one's touched it. Now, I'm about as postmodern of a person as they come, and at my most cynical, I tend to think that it's just interpretation all the way down. But it's music that always stops me in my tracks. I simply don't know how to get around the seemingly independent, objective givenness of this musical phenomenon. And that seems to me to be exactly the point that Professor Illman is making, that music is uniquely capable of generating interreligious dialogue because, to quote Begbie, sympathetic resonance is clearly not a case of diminishment. Rather, the more the lower string sounds, the more the upper string sounds. The tones we hear are not in competition, nor do they simply allow each other room. The lower sound establishes and enhances the upper, frees it to be itself, and without compromising its own integrity in doing so. End quote. All this to say, I'd love to hear more from Professor Illman about this aspect of the IRCF's music making and the implications it has for interreligious dialogue. Likewise, I'd like for all of us to consider the otherwise unrealized opportunity that music presents, especially when it involves humans of various religious and, I should say, non-religious backgrounds creating music together, offering up their voices in such a way that each individual voice resonates with its harmonic other. Again, we're thinking here purely of music as music. So when it comes to the IRCF, set aside for a moment any consideration of the religious texts that did, in fact, inspire the music, or whether or not the setting of the performance is traditionally religious or not. For undergirding this entire interreligious project is an irreducibly musical phenomenon in which the vibrations emanating from one human's vocal cords not only make possible, but also enrich and expand upon the vibrations emanating from the vocal cords of another. It's an aesthetic practice that begins with this thing called sympathetic resonance, but it's one that ends with empathy, in large part because it demands not only that I listen for the voice of the other, but that I respond in such a way that my voice is fully expressed only insofar as it frees the voice of the other to be fully itself. Yes, number 2. I give a hearty yes to a non-binary approach to interreligious dialogue. It seems as if it should go without saying. We probably think this every time we speak on this topic. But just as Dr. Illman suggests, there is no such thing as musical meaning that isn't always already affective or emotional. Indeed, it is for this very reason that music, in the service of interreligious dialogue, is able to move participants beyond a purely intellectual paradigm that focuses on ways in which the problem of religious otherness is, quote, solved by making the other intelligible and thus manageable. It's, of course, theoretically possible to analyze music without considering its emotional dimensions, but to do so is to eliminate the very thing that makes music a human enterprise. The "and" I would like to add to this has to do with the ways in which an acknowledgement of music's inherent affectivity or emotionality presses us to consider the inextricable role that our bodies play in the production, performance, and reception of music. As cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind like Mark Johnson have suggested, just as there is no human meaning without art and aesthetics, there are no artistic or aesthetic experiences that operate independently of the human body. What this means is that the individual bodies of the choir members are implicated in the deeply emotional process of musical creation, performance, and reception. What is more, it is only in and through their embodied performance that a deep sense of shared affectivity among the members of the choir, and by extension, the audience, is made possible. Dr. Illman identifies the bibliodramas, or at least you did in your earlier text, these bibliodramas that the choir during rehearsals enact as examples of how music can bring together both intellectual reflection and embodied experience. And that just makes me wonder, what of the singing itself? Even if there were no underlying religious text to dramatize, the act of rehearsing particular pieces of music until they become habituated in our bodies, the performance itself, and even the ability for the audience to perceive this performance, these are all profoundly embodied practices. As such, there's a wonderful opportunity here to explore further the ways in which individual members of the choir as a collective body, and the audience who enjoys the fruit of the choir's labor all bring their bodies to this interreligious dialogue. In doing so, they not only embody this musical meaning as persons embedded in a particular context, but they also experience the extension of their bodies in and through the musical aesthetic event. And again, not to beat a horse, but as we are bringing our bodies into context in public these days, that is a risk in its own right, is to actually come as a fully embodied being and all the risk that entails in public life, especially in interreligious contexts. Yes, number 3. Yes to music as creating space for interreligious encounters. By pointing out that the audience has a role to play in how we think about the emotional, embodied aspects of this music, I'm suggesting that Professor Illman's insights are inviting us to reconsider the ways in which the choir's performance creates a particular kind of space, not only for the choir members, but for the audience as well. Music is nothing if not three-dimensional. It sounds and resounds in concrete space and in real time. As a consequence, some musicologists prefer to talk about music, quote unquote, filling the physical space in which a listener resides. But I think it's perhaps more accurate to say that music establishes the contours of a given space and then invites listeners to fill that space with their own fully embodied meaning. That being said, I also want to acknowledge that certain music can and often does fill the musical aesthetic space it creates with its own ready-made meaning. In fact, it probably wouldn't be too difficult for any of us to cite the lyrics to a song that functions in exactly this kind of heavy-handed way, especially if we were to choose a song heard primarily in our own religious context. It's the sort of music that leaves the listener with no interpretive options, which, in my mind, actually distorts and works at cross purposes with music as music. But the overdetermination of musical meaning isn't related to lyrical content alone, even though those would be the examples I think we would most often cite. Take Richard Wagner's leitmotifs as an example. Oh, I earlier said something bad about the harpsichord, and now some Wagnerian things, sorry. Wagnerian leitmotifs are purely musical figures, but they function in an intentionally overdetermined way. In this sense, as they appear time and again over the course of one of his operas, Wagner's leitmotifs actually functions more like language than music. They're almost entirely indexical rather than musical per se. Now, none of this is to suggest that the repetition and development of certain musical figures is bad or wrong. Rather, I'm simply trying to point out that different kinds of music create different kinds of spaces. Some music creates pre-filled spaces in which the meaning already exists, spaces in which listeners are required to do little more than hear it and accept the music's take on life in the world. Other music, and I would say the best music, has the potential to create a space in which listeners are invited and encouraged to engage in a mutually transformative dialogue, both with the music and with the other. The only catch is that in order to accept this invitation, we must bring the whole of ourselves. For this reason, I'd love to hear more about this particular kind, or the particular kind of musical spaces that the IRCF's performances open up, and to maybe consider whether and how these spaces invite the audience to join the choir in a collaborative project of music making as transformative dialogue. So to recap, yes to music as music, yes to music as emotional, and finally, yes to music as creating space. And even beyond interreligious dialogue, I'm convinced that the Tehillim Solomon Project can and does offer a vision for the kind of constructive and peaceful boundary crossings that are desperately needed in order to navigate a public sphere increasingly permeated by fear-mongering, partisan rancor, and ideological divisions, both real and imagined. To put a finer point on the matter, whereas some would build walls to keep the racial, ethnic, and religious other out, music throws open the gates, and with arms stretched wide, welcomes us all, to quote the psalmist, into wide open spaces. Spaces where the otherness of the other isn't ignored or dissolved, but becomes the very resource that generates and sustains our ability to flourish in a plural world. Thank you.